Hello everyone. Today I want to show you the next two versions of my storage system. Since last time I've made a bunch of improvements to the version with the bulk, I've made a bunch of improvements to the splitters, and I've added a bunch of safety features to make it really difficult to actually break the storage whilst it's running. Now, unlike last time, where I split the showcase video and the build tutorial into two separate videos, this time I'm just going to do it in a singular video. So because of that, the entire thing is split into three parts. First, I'm going to start with a just general showcase of the capabilities of the storage, as well as showing it actually sorting things. Then I am going to go through the entire storage and explain everything there is to know about it and how exactly it functions. And lastly, I'm going to be making basically the exact same thing I did with the tutorial video last time, where I just explain some of the more difficult to put together parts of the storage and things you just kind of have to know that might not be immediately obvious from the Vault download. First, a little showcase. I have here a barrel with 20 boxes of random stuff that I'm all going to throw in here now. To all the people that watched the first two videos on the storage, this is probably all going to seem very familiar. In its most basic form, the entire storage is a multi-item sorter with the whitelisters under the slices here that you can configure to whatever you want. So for example, this would be the terracotta slice. That works with just Shulkerboxes. So the input to the system has to be inside of a Shulkerbox. If I try to put an item in there instead of putting a box in there, and I confirm the input here with this button, the storage will scream at me in the floor here, and the Crimson Pine will be returned to me over here. Now, there's also now a safety feature, unlike last time. When this fills up completely, the storage will block you out from inputting any more items into the storage until you've emptied this barrel out. So that's definitely something of note. Now, you might have also noticed that there's now a lot more general interface than there used to be. For example, there is now a lamp here that tells you when your boxes have been split fully and are returned to you from the splitters. So if you input boxes into this chest, they will go to a Shulkerbox splitter, where you will take mixed random boxes and they get turned into regular boxes of a single item type, and then they get unloaded into each slice. Now, another thing that the storage does that might be a little bit different from what you're used to from regular storages is that it will bypass boxes. So if you have a Shulkerbox above a certain single strength, say for example you have a Shulkerbox of a bunch of andesite, and you input it into the storage, that box is going to go straight to the slice with its quantity in here. There's a bunch of items in the box and they don't get unloaded into the slice. Like for example, if you have loose andesite in a box somewhere, it would just go straight to the slice. You can configure at what single strength this bypass happens, and I'm gonna show that later. You might have also noticed that the bulk has changed a little bit. So there's two slices on the slide here. You have the bulk. This is for single item types that you just have a bunch of. The bypass boxes in this case go into this Shulkerbox display at the top here. We might see a couple more boxes. Maybe we have some cobblestone or something. Nope. Oh, there you go. We have some stone here. And in this case, you can access the boxes directly from the display in the top here. If you click the notebook again, it will break the box and you can pick it up and do whatever with. And if there's a second box in there after it, it is going to place that then again as well. You also have the loose items in the slice directly, they just get loaded in there. And on the other side, we have the mist slices, just like before. Here you can configure any random items into a category. For example, this would be the concrete chest. And yep, there was apparently some concrete in those mixed boxes as well. Another special thing here is if you want to override the automatic bypass for the boxes and you want all boxes to be bypassed, there's these buttons in the ceiling on the copper bulbs. You can press these, and pressing these will make the box not get unloaded for that particular slice. So I think I had an example set up over here where I have pressed the button and I put in some prismarine, and as you can see, the boxes get bypassed directly into the slice in this case, unlike with the bulk where they get put onto the box display at the top here, and don't get unloaded, even though there's a really low item quantity in the boxes, in this case only 32 items. I have the bypass configured to basically bypass exactly about, I think this many items would get bypassed. Another thing that is to note about the storage is the speed. It is incredibly quick for what it is. As it says by design, it will do indeed well over into the 200,000 items an hour. So the 20 boxes that are just input there for just a showcase will probably be done sorting entirely before I'm done talking about all of the things that need to be shown off here. We also have a bunch of these indicator lamps on the walls here now. These are new. They weren't in the last storage at all. They basically now indicate a bunch of things that could potentially be wrong with the storage. So if you have some kind of problem with the storage will now safely shut itself down and it will tell you. So you have to then go and attend to these lights in order to be able to turn the storage back on again. But I'm going to get into the nitty-gritty details of how to do all of that a little bit later in the video. Another thing you might have noticed, especially when I was flying in here, there's now a beacon in the center of the storage that indicates the status of the storage. So if the beacon is red, that means the storage is running, and you should not unlock the world, or you shouldn't leave the world. You can now actually unload the storage by running away from it and going somewhere else because I've integrated chunk loaders into it. But if the beam is red here, the storage is running and you probably shouldn't be logging out. If the storage is idle and not doing anything, you might have noticed earlier, the beam is going to be green. And as a third color, if the beam is orange, that means one of the indicator lights has indicated some kind of fault, and you need to go fix something. Another way the beam could turn orange is if you hit this pause sorting button here. Pressing this will immediately pause all sorting operations within the storage, except the unloading of boxes in the slice and the last item that was currently being split by the Shulkerbox splitters. So there's some caveats with this pause button that I'm probably going to go over a little bit later, but note that just because you press this button doesn't immediately mean you can unlog. But as you can see, pressing that button causes the storage to go significantly more quiet than usual. It will enable the input lock, so I can now not actually input any items in here, even if I try. And it turns the beacon color to orange, indicating that the storage is, in this case, paused. But obviously this would also happen if the storage were to automatically detect some kind of fault. If you press the button again, it turns back off again, and the storage is going to continue. We're probably going to hear some noise again in a second. This chest right here, the reason why I now have an indicator lamp for this chest obviously always existed, is because I kept forgetting that there was boxes in there that I needed to take out, and I lost a bunch of boxes that way. So I now have an indicator lamp for it. But technically speaking, this isn't necessary. You don't need to build this. The input itself hasn't changed pretty much at all in a bunch of versions, but for the sake of the people who haven't watched the last videos, as I already said, you can only input Shulkerboxes into the storage. If you have loose items, like for example, I don't want to get rid of those, so just grab something else here. If you have loose items you want to get rid of, there is this display box here. You can input items into this display box, and flicking this lever is going to break it and immediately place a second one. There's a very large buffer of empty boxes in the back here you can also take out and do whatever you want with. When breaking this, it is going to put the box into the input here, and it is going to wait until you press and confirm the input. Now, the reason why this button exists is because I wanted to make sure that you don't accidentally put your tools or something in there and then have to wait a couple of seconds until they pop up into the barrel again, so you can actually be 100% sure of what you're inputting into the storage. Another thing that has stayed from the last couple of versions of the storage is the skip splitting button. Now, as I've already mentioned, right now in its most basic configuration, the storage will take any inputted boxes and it will send them to a splitter first, where they will be split into their individual parts. So in this particular case, this box would be split into a crimson plank and a pearlescent frog light, and the plank would be sorted into wherever I've sorted planks into, and the same thing goes for the frog light. Now, I can press this button, and what happens now is the box is going to skip the splitting step entirely, and it is going to be sorted basically as is. Meaning, in this particular case, this box would be sorted based on the first item type that's inside of here. So, crimson planks would be sorted together with the frog lights, and I can actually demonstrate this here. If I grab that box again, and I make the first item in the box a basalt item, and then I input them, we're going to see that the slice with the basalt in it is going to get one more item. This is going to be rather quick. And we should also see the pearlescent proglite and the crimson plank end up in here. Now, obviously, you probably don't want your box to be unloaded when you're doing something like this, because you don't want pearlescent proglites and crimson planks in slices of your basalt items. However, the utility of this is twofold. First, you can set up specific categories, whitelisters, or, for example, your ender chest boxes. So you can have ender chest boxes, and the first item in your ender chest boxes is some kind of renamed item, for example, which would send all of those boxes to a slice that is specifically configured to take those boxes. And for example, you could then press the button in the ceiling to make sure all of the boxes go straight into that slice without ever getting unloaded. So you can essentially just do box sorting on top of being able to do item sorting. And the second reason for why this button is incredibly useful, say for example, I had an entire Shulkerbox like this, and I know that it is an entire Shulkerbox like this, maybe because I inputted the items manually or because I picked it up from a farm somewhere that made this specific output. If I were to send this in here now and split it, it would have to unload the entire Shulkerbox, and it would have to reload the entire Shulkerbox, and only then would it get sorted. If I know that I have boxes of only one item type, I can press the skip splitting button, and sending this box in now is going to mean that it is not going to go through that unnecessary sorting step, and it is going to go straight into the slice. In this case, because it's a bulk item, it's going to go into the display at the top here. This way you can drastically reduce the sorting time for boxes where you know that you only have a single item type in them. Now, there is a caveat to this. If you press this button, it is immediately going to switch over to skipping the splitter. So if you had items in here that were draining out and you press that button whilst that was happening, the other half of that drained item type is going to go straight into the skipped splitting mode. So if you want to make sure that all of your items that you want to get split and all of the items you don't want to get split get separated off into those two categories, you're going to have to wait until the chest empties completely, switch this button over and confirm a second input, essentially. By the suspicious lack of sound, I'm going to assume the storage is done sorting its items. And yes, the beacon has turned back to green again. It means the storage is completely done sorting all of its items, and it is also done unloading all of the boxes into their slices. This beacon will not turn back to green again unless that is also done. So in case you're wondering why it's gone really quiet, but the beacon is still red, it is probably still unloading something somewhere in a slice. But this now means that this area is safe to unload, and you can log out of the world now. Now, the first thing you should do every single time the storage is done sorting is you should check the overflow slice. This is where all the items will go that the storage didn't know where to put. This includes things like unstackable items, items that have been renamed in some kind of way, and don't have a slice, and any item that you have yet to have assigned a slot to in any of the filters. Now, I recommend looking at these every single time the storage is done sorting and assigning a slice to them, so that you, if you were to insert them again the second time, because you clearly seem to have them if they end up here, that they actually go find a slice to be put in. Unlike last time, the slice here will no longer break the entire storage when it overflows, because there is now an overflow protection for all of the slices that I'm going to talk about a little later. But I still would keep an eye on the slice and make sure it doesn't fill up too far. Now we can also look at a couple of these slices here. As you can tell, a bunch of items have been sorted into these. Here's also a box that has been bypassed directly into the slice, so it was just full enough. And yep, as you can see, there's two more over here too. Now, a couple of other things I wanted to mention, in fact I kind of already mentioned it a little bit, so I'm just quickly going to talk about it more now, is I've added chunk loaders to the entire storage now. So there's now a clock that runs under the storage that is on the entire time the storage is on. This also controls the beacon display here. But this also allowed me to put a very easy chunk loader onto the storage. And as you can tell, this chunk loader, you only need 2 portals to actually chunk load the entire storage here. And another thing I wanted to mention is, unlike last time, the storage is no longer directional in any way. You can now rotate this in any direction you want, and you can mirror it, and you can do basically whatever you want with it. I've tried a couple of different orientations, and so far I've not found a single one that broke the storage in any way, shape, or form. Because I fixed a couple of bugs, mainly with the input over here, and the splitters that were preventing the storage last time to be rotated in any way. So you can now rotate this freely, however you want. And last but not least, for the actual showcase, just like last time, there's a version that doesn't have a bulk attached to it. It's significantly smaller than the version with the bulk, and that's also because there's 2 less splitters here, as you don't need that many splitters if you don't have the bulk in any way. This means the storage is a little bit slower than the big version. However, it obviously also means that it is a little bit easier to build, and if you don't have the necessity for such a huge storage or a lot of bulk, then this is probably the better version to build. However, the version with the bulk has gotten fairly far and advanced by now, and I wouldn't really consider it to be something experimental anymore. So if you have the space and the, I guess, necessity, then I do recommend building the big version over the small version here. Besides that, they're basically identical. The interface is exactly the same, the overflow is exactly the same, the bypass for the slices is exactly the same. 2 minor differences. There's no crafter embedded into the wall here. I needed that crafter in the bulk version for a single frame comparison with a comparator, but I couldn't fit it anywhere else besides into the wall, so it's a decorational piece there now. But here I didn't need that. And the second difference is that the overflow slice is not the slice directly first or adjacent to the input. It is the dead last slice of the actual storage. This was a necessary change because of the way I changed how the boxes get bypassed into the slices now. And I can no longer wrap the minecarts all the way around and put them into the first slice anymore. If this bothers you, go build the big version. But yeah, that's about it for the entire showcase of the storage. And I will now get into an explanation of how the entire storage actually works, as well as some more details on things that I just kind of glossed over right now. I'm now going to explain what all of the indicator lamps on your input do. These 4 lamps here are all now directly connected to the storage's automatic fault detection system, and are here to notify the player of some kind of problem that the storage cannot fix by itself. I have now simulated one of these that I'm going to explain in a minute here, but first, the one in the bottom right here, this is the input lock. If the input lock is active, you cannot actually input items into the storage anymore. This is a new thing that I've added from the last storage that can be triggered by various things, either automatically by the storage itself, or for example by something like you pressing the pause splitting or pause sorting button. This will also cause this to happen. Another thing that will always happen when the input lock goes active, or any of these lamps go active, is the beacon will turn to orange. Now to the actually blinking light here. This is the slice overflow warning. I have now erroneously activated this to kind of show off how you would fix it. It means that one of your slices, so either the miss slices, the bulk slices, or the slices for the chest, the box display here, have overflown and are at risk of losing your items because they can't be stored anymore. This will cause the storage to essentially completely scramble itself and go into hiatus until you found the particular slice that is causing this problem. I'm now going to simulate this being fixed by replacing this crafter and emptying it to a degree that the storage finds sufficient, essentially. In which point the storage beacon will turn back to green again, the input lock will no longer be active, and the light will no longer be blinking. The 2 on the left here are both directly connected to the empty box loop. So the storage essentially relies on a bunch of empty boxes in order to function properly, as it has to do any of its item sorting inside of boxes. You can see the buffer for this empty box loop over here, as well as continued over here for your display box. And the 2 lamps are hopefully fairly self-explanatory. This loop is a completely closed system, and the system can either overflow or get too empty. The TLDR is, if the lamp says overflow, this box here has gotten significantly too full, and you need to take out a bunch of these shulker boxes in order to make that lamp turn back off again and be able to use the storage again. If the opposite is true, and the empty boxes need refilling, you need to walk all the way out here to this chest stack, and you need to refill this with empty boxes. The reason for that might seem kind of obvious, but I'm still going to explain the empty box loop in a little bit more detail here, because it is actually kind of important to know how it works. This box loop starts with these splitters taking boxes and putting items inside of them by doing their usual splitting action. This will fairly rapidly empty this buffer here, and it will then directly be replenished by the unloading array, both for the miss here and for the bulk. The boxes will basically return back into this overflow here, or into the actual buffer. This will drastically determine how fast the storage is capable of running, as whilst it is running, due to the fact that the splitters are significantly faster than the unloading step here, it can happen that it will essentially have to throttle pause itself every once in a while. Because of that, you want to make sure that this loop is essentially as full as possible. That lamp in there will only turn on when this is so critically low already that the storage would essentially break if it were to continue running. So it is kind of your job to make sure that at the very least this double chest at the top here is always full with boxes if you want to ensure the speed of the storage kind of being intact in a sort of sense. Now the only way boxes will actually leave the box loop here, as it's technically speaking a closed system, is if boxes get bypassed. As you can tell, all of these boxes here are white. That's because they were once part of the empty box loop, or alternatively they were once part of the item input over here. If this happens often enough, that chest will be empty enough at some point for you to have to go refill it again. And another thing that's obviously going to chew through your backlog of boxes incredibly quickly is bypassing boxes with really low signal strengths. If you do this too much, you're basically going to start to run out of boxes very quickly, and this is where you might actually see this lamp turn on. So at that point, you might be wondering how it's even possible for the boxes to overflow instead of being too empty. And that's basically a bit of an edge case that can happen if you spend a lot of time with the skip splitting button. As I've already explained earlier, when pressing this button, the splitting step will be completely bypassed, and any boxes you input will be directly added to the empty box loop, as they will be unloaded directly into the slice unless they're being bypassed into the box display, for example. This will also mean that any named boxes you input whilst the skip splitting step is active will be added to the empty box loop. Now, best case scenario, if it was completely full, is they will end up back in this chest here. And this is how it can happen that this chest completely overflows, in which case you would end up losing boxes again. And because they were potentially named, I decided to give this a warning too, even though it's fairly unlikely for this to ever happen unless you spend a lot of time with this button right here. So let's explain how the storage works by actually following a box as it gets inputted. I'll quickly grab a random box here. I will then put the box into the input, and we can see where the box exactly goes when you input it. In this case, it will go straight to the splitter because I'm not bypassing the box. It will then go run into the first empty splitter that it finds, where it will then be sequentially unloaded, where each item type gets boxed into its own unique shulker box. That's essentially what the splitter does. This is an 8x hopper speed shulker box splitter I designed. In reality, it will actually run a little bit slower than that, depending on what is in the box exactly. And the general rule of thumb for that is the higher the quantity of items in the box, and the lower the variety of items in the box, the faster the splitter will actually split. Beyond that, you might have already noticed that the splitter looks a little bit different from how it did last time. It is now 4-wide tileable, meaning it is much, much easier to build together like this. Even the 6 splitters that I had in the last version here, they take up basically a little bit less than half the space they used to. They're also completely toggle stateless now, and honestly, in general, just much easier to build. Although I'm going to go into detail as to how exactly to build them a little bit later. The way the input array at the top here works is a little bit different from how you might expect it. Each splitter will request a box when it doesn't have anything to do. and it will only receive a single box every single time it requests one. The box will then be distributed via this instant dropper line. That has also changed a little bit. I'm no longer using the budded pistons for this. Box will then be distributed via this instant dropper line to each one of the splitters. So it will only ever actually input 6 boxes. And any remaining boxes will wait in the dropper until one of the splitters is ready for the next box. This is a little efficiency boost in a sense that will make sure that you don't end up with a single splitter getting a bunch of boxes and the other ones idling and not doing anything. Now, after the boxes get made or broken, they end up in this water stream all the way at the bottom here where the loaders for the splitters are. And they will travel up this bubble column, which is the exact bubble column items would end up in if you bypassed the splitting step via the button in the menu downstairs. And they will now be inputted into this 8 game take bulk. This is just an 8 game take box sorter, because what we've essentially done here now is via the splitting step, we've turned all of our boxes from mixed boxes into boxes of a single item type. So it is really easy to sort them to where you want them to go now. The 8 game take bulk also prevents me from having to use that god-awful bypass or pre-sorter that I was using before, as it is incredibly quick because it's based on the 8 game take box sorter by Rapscallion here. The boxes will then be shot all the way through the bulk. If they go into the bulk, they, just like I mentioned earlier, will be subjected to a single strength check at the input, and then either be bypassed directly into the slice up the top here, or be put into the unloading array for the bulk right here. As I've already mentioned, this will only ever unload one item type per slice, and it will only do that sequentially, so make sure that if you're inputting a bunch of boxes of the same item type, that they don't have to spend about an hour in the unloading array slowly getting sequentially unloaded into the slice. If the boxes do not fit into the bulk, they get dispensed into this water stream and travel all the way over here into the input to the miss. The miss hasn't changed basically at all. I'm still using Inspector Talon's 32 game take card miss. And the way this works is the box's input. They get placed every 32 game ticks or on top of the stopper here. The first item is then pulled out of the box, and the box is then broken and put into the second slot of the hopper minecart. The minecart then drives off and drives under the whitelister chests, and if it finds its correct slot, like for example there's a book in here, it'll pull this in. The minecart will then go up into the slice, the book is put back into the whitelister, and the cart travels up this bubble elevator. Another thing that happens is at the beginning when the box gets placed here, this comparator reads out the signal strength, and if the signal strength is above a certain level, it will eventually turn off this redstone torch here. So the minecart travels up, it then pulls the first 2 items out of the cart again, and the item that was pulled out at the bottom is recombined with its box. And if the signal strength was then high enough, this torch will turn off for a brief second, and the box is bypassed directly into the slice. The minecart itself travels off into the seeder, and all of its items get recycled back into the massive buffer I have for hopper minecarts here. The hopper minecarts act both as the item blocking off the last slots here, and obviously the item being placed to actually move about. If the box does not get bypassed, just like over in the bulk, it gets put into the unloader, into this fairly large unloading array. Last but not least, as I've already explained, the empty boxes will then be joined back into the empty box loop again. On both sides, both for the bulk and for the miss, they will join up back into the buffer for the empty boxes over here. Now, I've already talked about the empty box loop, so I'm not going to go into much detail about how this works right now again. The thing, however, to note here is that naturally, whilst the system is running, due to the splitters having a very high demand for boxes, if all of them are running simultaneously, this will naturally drain itself of boxes. And at some point, once the system detects that there's not enough boxes in the buffer anymore, it will cause a fault. An automatic fault detection will kick in, and it will pause the splitters in this particular case. And this doesn't just happen for the empty box loop here. This happens for a bunch of things. Basically, whenever you see an orange circuit somewhere in the storage, it's a safety circuit. It would overlook any of the inputs. So the input for the mist, the input for the bulk, and the input to the array, as well as, to a lesser degree, also the input to the storage itself. It will make sure your empty box loop doesn't completely run out. And it will also make sure the buffer for the boxes being unloaded in the unloader here don't overflow. The last system, that would have been a pretty big problem that didn't have an actual safety attached to it. And now the storage will detect that and then throttle itself down to wait until the buffer is full enough or empty enough again to take boxes. This goes both for the miss as well as for the bulk. Another overflow that's detected is the overflow for the slices themselves. So as I've explained earlier already, when I was explaining the safety mechanisms here, if the slices completely overflow, both for the miss, for the bulk, as well as for the box display here, the system will also throw a fault. And in that particular case, it will also put a warning on the board here. The only types of warnings the system will actually put on the board are warnings that the player has to do something about. So if you don't have a warning on the board, but you feel like the storage is currently throttling itself in some kind of way, that's because it's automatically resolving the fault for you. The only downside of that is that it might take a little bit longer to finish sorting whatever you are sorting. Speaking of all of these safety circuits, it is time to mention the caveats of the pause button. If you press this button, what will actually happen is it pauses basically all of the inputs to the storage, like the input for the miss, the input for the bulk, the input for the splitter array. It will also pause the splitter. As you can see, this line of redstone has turned off now and these pistons have retracted. However, what it will not be able to do is it will not be able to prevent the splitter from finishing splitting the item that it was currently splitting. And since that could potentially be an entire box full of a single item type, it can take up to 90 seconds for it to finish or actually pausing the splitter. And the second thing the pause will not be able to do is it will not be able to pause the unloading. So whenever you have a lot of boxes buffered, for example, and you press that pause button, it is going to continuously still unload the boxes because there's nothing I can do about pausing the unloading step. So whilst the pause button is a thing, and you can definitely use it, please keep in mind that unless the beacon here has actually turned green, again, it is never 100% safe to actually unlock and leave the game. I do believe that is all of the sort of like general functions and how the system actually runs. If I forgot anything, I will probably mention it in the next part, as I will now be explaining how to actually put some of the more annoying or tricky parts together when you want to actually build this in your world. I'm going to start the segment by talking about the version you're going to need for this. To my knowledge, there has not been any major enough changes to Redstone in order for the system to not work in the same version that the last system worked in. And basically all of the same requirements you needed for the last system apply to the new system now too. However, there's a couple of points I quickly wanted to make about this. First, this entire system was tested and built in Minecraft 1.21.4. So if you really want to be sure that it works, use that version. And second, these portal chunk loaders, the specific ones I'm using here, use a trick that was added in Minecraft 1.21.2, meaning you cannot go below that if you want to use this specific chunk loader. If you're willing to build your own chunk loader to keep the entire area chunk loaded, as you are not forced to use my design here, you can go down as low as the version for the last storage. If you want to use this exact chunk loader, you're going to have to be a Minecraft 1.21.2 or above. And I also currently do not see a reason for why the system shouldn't work in Minecraft 1.21.5. Next, a thing that hasn't changed from essentially any version of the storage I've ever made. The first chest, first encoder chest that you can see here, that isn't even part of the actual slices anymore. As you can see, there's nothing here. Needs to have a box in the first slot and be filled with this exact amount of blocker encoder items. This is so that the storage can handle empty box inputs. If it doesn't have this, it won't like you very much anymore if you accidentally input an empty box. And the same also goes for the chest over here. As you can see, the slice starts here, but there's an encoder chest right here that has a box in it. Next, I'm going to show how to set up the whitelisters. So these double chests at the bottom here all have to be filled with this exact quantity of this 64 stackable encoder item. And the last 3 slots have to be filled with some shovels. These shovels can be replaced by a full stack of the renamed 64 stackable. And you're going to have to do that to set up 16 stackables. I'm going to explain it in a second. But first, if you want to set up a 64 stackable, the way you do that is you just take your 64 stackable, you left click it on the slot, you take out one of the encoder items and you're done. However, there's a caveat with this. Make sure that you don't set up duplicates. So for example, if I were to do this in the same encoder chest, I now have 2 of the item. This would break and you would have to spend a very long time fixing it. So make sure there is no of the same encoder item here in the actual same whitelister. If you accidentally set up the same encoder item as I had over here in 2 different whitelisters, it's always going to go put the item into the first one. And it is never actually going to put the item into the second chest here, so you've just kind of wasted a slot on your whitelister, but it won't break anything. Now, if you want to set up 16 stackables, like for example these eggs, you need to keep in mind that a 16 stackable has a 4 times higher signal strength than a 64 stackable. So doing just this would break this slice, it wouldn't work anymore. You have to take out 4 items of the renamed encoder item for every 16 stackable you want to add. So I've only taken out 1, and you take out 3 more, and now this slice works again. If you want to hear if what you've done didn't break the storage, really easy to check. There should be an audible piston noise every time you remove one of the encoder items. If you hear that noise, it means that you've done something correctly and it works now. However, you might have already be able to tell because it does actually make a noise when I mess with this chest in some kind of way. You shouldn't be doing this whilst the storage is running because there's a small but existing chance that you might just at the exact wrong time extend a piston downstairs that would completely break your whitelisters. And from all of the things in the storage to have to fix, the whitelisters are probably the worst ones. So just for safety, don't do this whilst the storage is running. Next, I'm going to talk about how to add slices to the storage or to remove them. Generally speaking, I wouldn't recommend anyone without some decent redstone knowledge to try and remove and or add slices to the storage. It's just there's too many things involved in this that make that a little bit tricky. However, generally speaking, it is possible to add or remove slices from the storage. The bulk is probably the easiest. You can totally extend the bulk probably all the way up to match the amount of mist slices you have. The only thing that you need to keep in mind here is that the overflow protection for the buffer, for the unloader, might not work properly anymore if you add or remove a bunch of slices from it. So you might have to mess with the signal strength in this crafter here. Now, something very similar goes for the regular mist slices. However, they have an additional caveat. The longer the mist slices become, or the more there are, the more items do you need in this chest here. So if you've added a bunch of slices, I recommend adding more than this amount of hopper minecarts here. Otherwise, they might completely drain, and in that case, you would end up breaking their whitelisters, which wouldn't be great. And very similarly to the bulk slices, they also have this overflow protection for the buffer, for the unloader here. And once again, you might have to mess with the single strength of this crafter here to make that properly work again. And the way you check if it still functions is you grab the slice that would be the longest or the furthest away from the input. So for the mist slices, that would be the last slice over here, this one. And for the bulk slices, that would be the last slice over here. So I'm just going to explain this with the bulk slices because it's essentially the same process for both of them. If the protection system here goes off at the correct time and activates at the correct time, then this double chest here, in this case, and in the other case, the second barrel for the buffer, the overflow, shouldn't actually completely fill up. The storage should essentially stop inputting items before the buffer completely fills up because the protection activated, obviously. Now, the way you kind of make sure that this still works is you might have to reduce the signal strength required to actually activate the buffer here. So maybe click one of these buttons and make the crafter have a lesser signal strength, and then you might be able to get away with it. However, you're absolutely going to have to experiment in a creative mode testing world first to see if it breaks anything. Adding maybe like 5 more slices or something isn't going to require that because it's just 5 more slices. It's just not enough to cause too much of a problem. But if you want to do significantly more than that, I would recommend checking that first. Removing slices is incredibly easy. If you don't want any of the bulk slices, just build a version over there. So that's all of the bulk slices gone. If you want less bulk slices in this, removing them is never a problem. Just quite literally move some kind of middle segment out and shove it back together again. Just note obviously that the last slice with all of the gizmos that you can see on here obviously needs to be the same. It just would be further in that direction at that point. And something very similar is also the case for the missed slices. You can remove essentially as many of them as you want if you don't want as many as I have here. And the thing you have to keep in mind here, obviously, is that the first and last slice are going to have to always be the same. You should always remove one of the middle slices and then reduce the length by kind of pushing it back together again. And in the case of the version without the bulk, you always have to make sure that the very last slice in the storage is the overflow slice. So this slice never actually moves. It is always the last slice, and you have to make sure it is always the last slice as well. Next is the placement for the minecarts for the loaders in the splitter, as well as the rail placements, as there are some rather strange rail placements in the splitters here nowadays. So first, the card placements. So if you want a really in-depth tutorial of that, I made a very extensive long version of this in the tutorial video I uploaded before this video. But the general gist of it is you want to have these two cards right here that sit on a mud block and here over 4 hoppers with its hitbox and directly over the 4 hoppers here. You can see the hitbox of the card slightly intersects all 4 of the hoppers. So any items going into this card get equally distributed among all of these hoppers. The way you do that is you grab these walls here. You have these 3 blocks. You replace them with walls. Then you place the minecart and you shove them into the corner of the wall. And for the minecart up here, it gets aligned against a fence gate on that block right there. So that block will be a fence gate. Where you just place the cart, you roll it over against the fence gate. And then you obviously break the fence gate and replace it with a glass block again. And that replacement in particular, if you've never seen this before, is based on a 0 tick. So if you want to move a block into a minecart, you can do that using a 0 ticked piston, which is really easy to do in survival. You just need a sticky piston and a button. You place the cart. Obviously you have to break the rail, otherwise this doesn't work. Then you can, for example, align the cart. So in this case I would actually need the rail again. For the top card here, right? You would align the card against whatever you want to align it. In this case, you would remove the fence gate again. And now you can place your sticky piston directly next to it. And you place a button on the side of the sticky piston. And pressing this button is now going to 0 take this block over and this card isn't going to move. You can do that from any angle with any of these blocks. And I recommend doing it for all of them, because you have to do it for most of them anyway. So this block, for example, has to be 0 ticked in. This block and this block has to be 0 ticked in. Whilst this block is technically speaking not necessary, I don't see a reason to not 0 tick it in either. And in this particular case, you can probably even replace it with a full block to reduce the lag of this hopper a little bit. This block obviously has to be 0 ticked in as well. And I would honestly just do all of them, because it also means that nobody can nudge these cards anymore now and ruin their alignment. And the other thing that's very important here is the rail placement. So for that, we are going to need powered rail, we're going to need an activator rail, and we're going to need a detector rail. So this rail in the splitters, it's actually broken right now because obviously I want to show it. So I'm going to have to grab this one over here. If I can find it, that is. Right here. This rail does not connect up to the detector rail. And the way you place that is a little bit tricky. So you first have to place your powered rail. That's no different. And then you place a detector rail right here. You place your detector rail you actually want to have right there, so it doesn't actually connect up. And then you remove this placeholder rail and you place your activator rail right here like this. And now you have this rail placement where they don't actually snap up and connect to one another. Now you're also going to have to bend up this activator rail. In that case, we're going to have to remove a bunch of things. So if you want to do this, you have to remove all of this. Obviously, we do this whilst building. You obviously do it first, unlike me here. Then you would bend up your activator rail. place all of your things back. And that last detector rail here also has to be bent up. And the way you do that is by removing this composter, placing a temporary rail there, breaking it again, place your composter back, and now you've bent up all of your rails. And for the very last step, obviously there always needs to be a minecart sitting on this activator rail, sliding into this honey block. That's a permanent minecart that needs to be there at all times. So yeah, that's how you do the rail setup for the carts. Up next, I'm going to explain how to set up the bypass for the boxes that don't get unloaded. So right now it is set to a single strength of 4, like this, which equates to a box that is almost exactly a third full. Reducing it is really easy. You just put this to 3 instead of 4, in which case it goes down to about this second strength. Increasing it with just the crafter only gets you a single strength of 9 out of the crafter here, which equates to a box that is about this full. So that's about 2/3 full at this point. If, for example, you only want to bypass boxes that are completely full, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to put this comparator into regular compare mode, not subtract mode. And then you're going to have to input a single strength of 15 into this comparator here. So you can either do this with a redstone block or with this trick where you just use a block with a lever on top of it that you power. And now this box is only actually going to bypass if it is pretty much exactly full. So any single strength below 15 wouldn't work anymore. Now it needs to be a completely full box. I wouldn't recommend doing this because this essentially never happens. At the very least, I would get a single strength of 14 instead of getting a single strength of 15. Because if you do that, it will output a signal starting from, what is it? About this point. And a box like this is just much more realistic. As it's not completely full, it can be like basically almost completely full at that point. But yeah, just maybe experiment for your own sake, for your own preferences with this. The only thing that you have to keep in mind, if you want to input a single strength into this comparator here, make sure that in this particular case it doesn't really matter because it wouldn't actually ever power anything, but make sure you don't accidentally power any of the crucial components of the storage. Next, a quick reminder that you need to chunk align the storage around the chunk loaders. So the chunk loader will load a 3x3 area around it, so this chunk, and this chunk with the entity processing chunks, meaning the entire storage has to fit within those 3 chunks, which it should always do, but it is fairly close, so make sure then when building this that you actually properly chunk align it. Now a rapid fire round of a bunch of containers that you're going to have to set. So this copper bulb here needs to be lit, so when placing it, it's off and you're going to have to power it. So it provides a single strength for both of these comparators. This chest here needs to have a random item inside of it, and the hopper below it needs to have 5 different random items inside of it. Same thing goes for over here, 5 random items in the hopper, and a different random item in the barrel on top of it. This is to update the comparator in the back here. This hopper right here needs to have some renamed 64 stackable inside of it. All of these hoppers need to have a renamed 16 stackable inside of them and 4 unstackable items. Specifically, all of the hoppers that point into this water stream over here always have the unique item filter inside of them. This over here is 1, 1, 1 until it points back into the water stream. This one only exists once with 2. All of the composters are set to a single strength of 1 until they aren't. So always make sure to check the composters when you see them. That also goes for the red center storage. If you see a composter, it has a fill level, and that fill level needs to be set. So these 3, for example, right here have a single strength of 1. However, this one has a single strength of 3. This one has a single strength of 2. And over here, there's another one with a single strength of 2. And we have the is on. This needs to have 5 items inside of it. The splitters also have a bunch of crafters. In fact, not just the splitters, once again, the entire storage. If you see a crafter, it is there to provide a single strength for a comparator, so make sure to check how many slots inside of the crafter are activated. In this case, this crafter has 9 slots activated, so if you see a crafter, make sure you check the amount of slots in it that are clicked off and then actually toggle them. This chest needs to be filled with hopper minecarts up to about this fill level. The fill level is dependent on how many slices you have. So for the amount of slices present here, you need this many cards. If you have less slices, you can probably get away with less items. If you have more slices, you're going to have to add more. And the first card you're going to have to place yourself by hand. So there needs to be a card that needs to be placed here, and you need to block off the last 3 slots with specifically hopper mine cards. The unstackable sorters also have a filter at the top of them. There needs to be 4 blocker items in these slots right here, and the item you want to filter goes into the first slot. The E4 hopper clock for the beacon display at the bottom here needs to have 24 items inside of it. Next, I'm going to explain some of the logic around the water streams in the storage. You might see me use all of these things in my hotbar to get water to do exactly what I want to do in the storage and think that they're kind of all interchangeable with one another. And whilst that is true for most of them, Lichen is the one exception to this, as it is possible to make these flowing one-wide water streams using Lichen. If I were to replace this with a sign, this water wouldn't be moving anymore, and whatever required this moving water stream would now be broken. So in this particular case, a Lichen is actually mandatory in this space right here. And last but not least, because there's one slightly annoying water stream to actually set up properly, I have this one. If you're building this, you might just get the bubble elevator up here and then try to flow the water over. And the water is just going to get stuck like this. So if you want to set this up, you're going to have to temporarily place a block here in the bubble elevator to make the water flow over, and then break the block and replace it with water again, so that the water flows back up and the 2 water streams join up with one another. And lastly, I want to talk about some of the color coding and the block choices that you have to make when building a storage. But first, the color coding. Any color of concrete essentially represents a particular circuit type in the storage, meaning purple is for anything that does box sorting or sorting of items in general. Light blue is for unloading. The lime is for the ISON for the beacon display, or just the ISON for the storage in general. Black is overflow management. Orange is any sort of security circuit that makes sure nothing breaks. Yellow is an input to either the storage itself or some of the subparts of the storage. Red is for anything that has to do with minecarts and minecart processing. White has to do with box processing, or it's just processing a box in some kind of way. Gray is the bypass circuit for boxes of higher fill levels just going straight into the slice. And for the splitter, all of the colors are unique for the splitter itself. So all the rules are just named you there, don't actually apply for the splitter. For the splitter, it's a similar story, but I had to duplicate some of the concrete colors because I ran out. So what type of blocks can you actually build your storage out of? Well, any of the concrete is part of some kind of circuit somewhere, and therefore needs to be a solid full block of some kind of way, shape, or form. This could be any solid building block you could potentially go gather. However, I recommend that you actually somewhat color code the entire storage to its individual circuits. You don't have to do it as precisely as I do it here. However, keeping at least somewhat track of what part of the storage does what in all of the individual circuits greatly helps with building this and makes it significantly less confusing to look at if you have to debug anything. Now, at the same time, you see me use glass quite a lot when building. Now, when glass is just a part of a bubble elevator or some kind of item transportation system, then yes, you could replace this glass with any full block as well, as long as the items are contained within the bubble column. However, when I use glass inside of a circuit somewhere, that means if it has anything to do with the redstone anywhere, please use actual glass. Don't just use some kind of like other transparent block like slabs or similar, because some of these blocks actually need to be glass blocks, and frankly I cannot remember which ones need to be glass blocks and which ones could be slabs. So just stay on the safe side and use glass blocks for all of these. You can, however, replace the bubble columns with full blocks if you really wanted to. And lastly, you have glazed terracotta in various places, usually in conjunction with some kind of sticky block. And these obviously need to be either some kind of immovable full block or just use any color of glazed terracotta. But technically speaking, this could also be crying obsidian or obsidian. I do believe that is all I had to say. For all of the people who actually managed to watch the entire hour-long video, congratulations. This is probably not going to happen all that often, as this is going to probably stay the de facto version of the storage for quite a long time, as I don't have any plans to make it better than it already is at this given point in time. Either way, I hope you had fun watching this. I'm going to leave a Vault download and probably this time also a Litematics file in the description if you want to actually try this out. If you have any questions or comments about this, I'm always on Discord. You can find me lurking around the Storage Deck Discord server. I'm probably going to put a link to that in the description too. Whilst you're at it, you can also then give a shout out to a bunch of the people on there because they helped me put a bunch of parts of the storage properly together. And besides that, I believe that is all I had to say. I hope you enjoyed watching this, and goodbye.